Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. I'm Jon Ackerman, Brian Bales, and we're coming into land on this series that we've called Restore. And because I just blanked, can you run us back through the different things that we've been talking about being restored?
We've been sort of going through the Advent calendar. For those people who came through a liturgical background, the Advent calendar or the Advent wreath is something you might be familiar with. But it's just a way to help yourself stay focused during Christmas time, and Advent just means coming. And Jesus coming did certain things. And there's several different Advent style wreaths, like you can do things about messengers and angels and shepherds and prophecy. But how we have done it particularly is another one. And the 4 outward candles on the wreath talks about the idea of hope, and then peace, and then love, and joy. If you ever want to know which one the joy candle is, it's the one that's the different color on the outer ring. And then on Christmas Eve, we will talk about the Christ candle in the middle. But we've been talking about Christ all the way through it.
Right.
But yeah, so we find ourselves on the 4th week of the Restore series, and we've been talking about this idea that we live in a world that there are a lot of experts that profess to be able to do what only Jesus can do. And he is the only life restoration expert. He's the only one that can put life back where it's been leaked out. And we've just been dealing with just some blunt truths that over the last 21 months, maybe more so than any time I can remember in my life, just been some life leaking out in lots of ways. And we can all use some more restoration on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, thank you for recapping the hope, peace, love, and joy. And it's funny you mentioned the joy candle being the different color, because as we were prepping for this one, we were realizing joy just feels a little bit different to talk about.
It does.
It's a little bit harder to just, put your finger on and say, this is what it is.
Well, we were talking about this in a podcast. It may have been the last one we did, or maybe it was a couple ago. It's one of those things where when someone said, well, how do you know that you're supposed to marry this person? And they say, you just kind of know it when you know it.
Yeah.
Joy feels somewhat like that categorically. And so for some people who are going to be listening today, they're probably going to want us to be a little bit more tighter than where we're going to wind up. But nonetheless, we definitely want to give you some, what I would like to say, some edge pieces to the puzzle, right? Some edge pieces of the puzzle that joy can't look like something outside of the edge pieces. But when these biblical edge pieces are set up, we understand where it's come from and how it's accomplished. The inside of that puzzle, for each and every one of us, it might look just a little bit different. And that's okay, because God designed us very specifically. So we don't have to live in this world where we're like all this cookie cutter in that way. So, but, Christmas cookies, I thought I'd talk about those for a second. Yeah,
that's always good. And so, as always, with this platform, Faith Forward, we want it to be practical. We want it to be helpful. We want it to be implementable, if I can say it that way. And so one of the first things that we decided we would do as we talked about joy is, and I have a mini soapbox here, so you'll just have to indulge me for a second. But one of the things that we sometimes need to do is deal with our bad definitions of what a word means, because words matter. And so my mini soapbox is literally has now come to mean, by definition, figuratively. We actually wore down Merriam-Webster, and they changed it in the dictionary to where now literally means both literally and not literally. And we've done that with a lot of words. We've done that with a lot of words where we've made them sort of interchangeable. And not because we don't care, but just because conversationally sometimes we're not terribly exact, and that's okay most of the time. But there are times where words matter, and the definition of words matter. And so when we talk about joy, one of the problems that we run into is that we often conflate joy with happiness, and we use them interchangeably. And that sets us up then, I think, for not only misunderstanding, but probably also some frustration when somebody, let's say, for example, hypothetically, they happen to be preaching a message about joy, and they're asking, do you have joy? Where do you find joy? And you're sitting there going, I'm not even sure I know what that word means. So when we talk about happiness and joy, how do we differentiate that?
Well, we first have to define the first 2 words correctly, right? So if we're assuming we're defining those words correctly in the first place, then we can differentiate them, appropriately. But when we talk about joy, and this is a generalized statement, but I think a true one, joy tends to be more an inner disposition, I don't even necessarily want to say feeling, even though disposition and feeling are very similar. But you can have joy and it not feel a particular way. So it's an inner disposition more than anything. And happiness is appropriately so an outward expression. And sometimes, by the way, happiness can come from that inner disposition. And sometimes, if we're trying to define happiness in a wrong way, can come from all kinds of other things that we believe that will then change our insides, right? And so I think we've all had moments, whether we've eaten too many Christmas cookies or we've done something, and we realize that the things that we're doing are much more motivated by some things inside we're trying to fix, whether or not it's I'm a workaholic, or whether I'm a cookieholic, or whether I'm an alcoholic, or whatever it might be, right? In that way. And so, those are kind of the difference. But one of the things, because, you had a mini soapbox, I'll get mine for a second, is there's nothing wrong with happiness. I grew up in a particular religious environment that always made this differentiation in a good way. And they would say something like this: happiness is based on happenings. It's a nice little turn of phrase. But I walked away with that sometimes thinking, well, I shouldn't be happy then. It's totally okay to be happy. God wants you to be happy, but he wants you to be happy coming from the right place. And so happiness is rooted in an expression of our inward joy in its most appropriate way. And so I think that's how, if we were trying to define both of those words accurately, that then we would just kind of, juxtapose them against each other. Yeah. So, but joy is more complicated, right?
It is. And so I went searching, right? Because I'm always curious to see how people use words, because words matter a lot to me. And so one of the ways that I saw somebody differentiate was, like you said, joy is an inner feeling, happiness is an outward expression. That joy is internal and happiness comes from usually an external trigger or a source. And I liked this phrase, and at the same time I really hated it, because it's true. Joy endures hardship and trial and connects with deeper meaning and purpose. And they said a person pursues happiness but chooses joy.
So let me give an example of that. Just popped in my head. And by the way, I don't know what this is like because I'm a male. But
can't wait to see where this goes.
Well, there's one very clear thing that no male can do that females can, and that's give birth. And let me just tell you about that. Is at the same time, as someone who's watched two of them now, the most painful and difficult thing ever, matched with joy, right? Because what they're enduring in that moment, they know is going to bring something greater. And so while I didn't mean to bring up some bad visuals for some people or that sort of stuff, I think that's a really good example, even in our earthly life, that there are times it's difficult, it's painful, but we handle it well with joy. We handle it well with joy. In an epidural, maybe for some people, but that's what I was thinking of when you said that. So that's one of those side trails that we often go on here at Faith Forward. If you don't like those, the email is faithforward@cfcwired.org. Just let us know.
That's right. But I think that is a really helpful, I was going to say visual, but it's a really helpful illustration of what I think sometimes happens because we misuse words. That when people are going through something difficult, right, it's easy to, as you say, Bible bomb them, or just drop well-meaning advice of, things like God works all things together for good, or, just the joy of the Lord will sustain you. And I think it's really helpful to come back to the significance of words, where there really is not, there isn't happiness most of the time in trials and hardship. And there's not actually supposed to be. And so if you're going through trials and hardship and you don't feel happy, that's good. You're not supposed to. But it is possible to have joy in the midst of. But I think because sometimes joy is the more elusive of the two in terms of what is it, we go to what we know, and then what we know doesn't show up where we feel like it's supposed to.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I hear you saying is happiness naturally comes and goes more.
Yeah.
Right? It comes and goes more. And we're not saying that's a bad thing. We're saying, if you are in the middle of this deep, biting pain and you're cackling happy, we're probably thinking that maybe you need to go see someone to talk about some things in your life. That's not at all what this is. So the happiness comes and goes, but the joy is something that, as internally, is something, and we use this term a lot, cultivated. It's an agrarian term, obviously. He is not Farmer John, but he does live on 5 acres, and he does like to do a lot of this sort of stuff. That it's something when we talk about cultivated, what do you mean by that when you say the word? I know what I mean when I say that, but words matter.
Well, and I think it goes back to this idea of you choose joy, right? Joy is intentional. And so just like cultivating, when you cultivate something, you plant it, you care for it, you maintain it, and you help it to develop. And so joy is a choice. Yeah. Right? Happiness is what you discover around you, the momentary happiness, right? This is a really great moment. I'm just going to bask in it and soak it up. You know, we're making cookies. I love cookies. Cookies make me happy, right? And it's possible to experience joy in that same moment, but that joy is probably going to be because I'm making cookies with someone I care about, or I'm making cookies for someone I care about. Right? It's this idea that joy connects with meaning and purpose, right? So the smell of cookies baking makes me happy, but it also elicits joy because it takes me back to a happy time in childhood. Yeah. Right? And so I think part of the challenge is these words will often show up in the same place, even though they don't mean the same thing. And that's part of what makes it difficult to not conflate the two and use them interchangeably. And so as we continue, as we progress with this conversation on joy, one of the things that we're going to try to keep in the forefront, and that we would encourage you to do as well, is that joy is an inner feeling. Happiness is usually triggered almost exclusively by the external reality around us. Joy is usually found in connection with hardship and trial. And it's usually found in connection with meaning and purpose. And it's a choice. It's not just happenstance. Joy isn't something that happens to us. Joy is something that comes up from within us, if we want to do it that way. Somebody else said it this way: joy is more consistent than happiness. Yeah. Because like you said, happiness comes and goes.
Yeah, and that's that idea of the external not dictating the internal. You were talking again, long-time listeners to the podcast know that John either does it on purpose or by accident, always says a couple things to make me sing songs in my head. And so the one that I'm singing right now is Joy to the World, right? It's Christmas time.
I got another one queued up for you.
Right, thank you. Joy to the world, the Lord has come, right? And what's interesting, if you think about the theological implications of that line, is that why there is joy is because of the presence of Jesus, not because, by the way, anything about the situation to which Jesus came into had changed for the shepherds. Yeah. Nothing changed for the shepherds. Yep. They still went back to their job. They were still the lowest people on the social ladder, right? Nothing changed for some. In fact, that is one of the great struggles of why so many people refuse to accept him as Messiah, is because they look first and foremost for him to change their circumstance. And that's where they thought they would get joy from, or peace or hope and all of that. And so when we understand, we talk about this, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but this idea we talk about in this series over and over again, that the root of experiencing all these things is based upon presence. And we also understand that the presence of Jesus as believers is always with us. The idea of consistency of joy is very real and very possible, right? Versus if we're dependent upon these things external that go up and down and change, well, that's not going to work.
Yeah. Where do you have your joy, 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 joy?
Down in my heart, just for the record, down in my heart. I also have the peace that passes understanding down in my heart. Do you know that verse?
No.
Oh, well, we'll sing that later on.
I tend to forget that song as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's probably good.
And as the great theologian Boston said,
it's more than a feeling. Yes, there you go. There's the reference.
Something else that I thought was interesting, though, as we started to look at this idea of joy, is that joy is, again, it connects with deeper meaning and purpose, which means it's often tied to things that have come before. Right? We talked about how you're baking cookies. The joy comes from who you're baking your cookies with, or who you're baking your cookies for, or how it reminds you of a happier time. It was also reminding me that joy is often anticipatory. It has to do with something that lies ahead. Right. And the verse that came to mind was referring to Jesus going to the cross. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. And so there again, you see the distinction between happiness and joy. There is no happy going to the cross.
I think you can look, and I mentioned this, I think, 2 Sundays ago, when you see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and I said, he said, Father, if this is possible, let this cup pass from me. He didn't feel, right? And if happiness by definition is more an external feeling, he didn't feel like going to the cross. Yeah. Right? There's nothing that said, woohoo, but for the joy set before him. He endured that. And, and again, I kind of go back to that illustration just a moment ago. It's very hard to wrap our heads around. And so, but if we've ever been around someone who's been through the difficulty of childbirth, side note, one of what I believe is the proofs of the existence of God. That God can take the same words and you can move forward 7 or 8 months and they mean something completely different. Like 2 months in, the lady's going to have the baby for the first time, has this revelation that this thing has to come out of me. And at 9 months, they say, this thing has to come out of me. It's just another side proof. But when you go through that, it's hard. You endure it, but there's the joy. That's the only reason people decide, hey, I want to step through this, because they know there's joy on the other side of it. And frankly, it's the only reason a lot of us, when we're really good at, do some of the things that God has called us to do. Yeah. If we're focused first on happiness, there is no way we're going to do it. But I love that reminder, as the joy set before me.
Yeah. And as I thought more about that idea of the joy set, like what was the joy set before him? It's primarily relational, right? It's the joy of being reunited with the Father. And it's the joy that comes from knowing that he's also paving the way for all of us to be reunited with the Father. Yeah. And so the joy that's before him, it's not the cross, right? It's not even solely paying the penalty for sin, but it's what that hardship is going to allow for. It's the restoration of relationship. And so another way that joy seems to differentiate itself from happiness is that happiness can have all sorts of external triggers. Right? I'm happy baking cookies. I'm happy if I get, a larger paycheck or a new car or, something fun comes in the mail.
Yeah.
But joy, like we talked about, it's deeper. It connects more deeply to meaning and purpose. And oftentimes it's inherently connected to relationship. And so again, part of what we're after here is just the practical definition of the thing that we're searching for so that we know where to look.
Yeah.
Because just like when we talked about love, another musical reference, we're often looking for it in all the wrong places.
We are.
And we often do it with joy, I think in part because we have a bad definition. We're looking for joy to be found in the places where we find happiness.
Yeah, and one of the things, if you have spent a substantial amount of time in your life feeling like you don't have joy, there's a part in all of us that craves that. Because God made us, wired us for pleasure, wired us for joy, and there's nothing wrong with saying wired for pleasure. And so when we're not having that, it just, my experience in my own life, and certainly as a chance to spend time with others, is that we will go seek out happiness. Thinking that is doing something that only joy can, which is why, we become cookie-holics, or why we become, whatever it might be, workaholics. We try to then take on the outside and do the inside. So, that's also a really good sort of, when you're thinking about indicator, where I am on this joy, when whatever is going on in my life, where do I go? What do I look to? Who do I look to first to sort of give us that sense of well-being? Because that's a way of defining joy that we'll talk about, in a second, about this sort of well-being.
Yeah. And we've talked about this section of scripture before on this platform as an example to something similar. Paul in prison in Philippians, talking about this deep-seated settledness, deep-seated contentment that he has regardless of circumstances. And it's funny, they don't use the word joy, but it's so much more closely tied to joy than happiness. Paul is not happy in prison.
No.
But he says he has a deep contentment.
Yeah.
And that's joy.
It's well-being. Yeah, it's that, you know what? Those moments, I don't know if you ever had them, and I hope you have. If you're listening to this, you're watching this, I really pray that you've had that moment, not where your world is falling apart. I don't wish that on anyone. But when your world is falling apart, because all of our worlds at some point has been falling apart, that right there in the middle of it, that you've been able to experience the power of God in your life and His presence in such a way that you're like, hey, I'm not apathetic. That's not contentment. Yeah. I'm like, okay, I can be here, not because I want to be here, but because He's here with me.
Yeah.
Right? And it changes so much. It changes how we approach whatever it is that God might ask us to do, or in my case a lot, it makes me feel okay with not doing anything until God asks me to do something. Because if you're wired like me, like John, when there is a discomfort, when there is those sort of things, I mean, like, well, what do we do? How do we go fix it? How do we do those sort of things?
Yeah. And I think, something else that might make this help make sense because in some cases it almost feels like we're hunting joy.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah,
where is it? How do I find it? I don't know where it is. I don't even know if I've ever felt it, right? Because some of us feel like we struggle with happiness in situations where we should be happy.
Yeah.
And so joy often feels like it's just as hard to discover. That there's something about joy that just, it feels like it doesn't make sense.
Okay.
And again, as we were prepping for this, the number of times that joy shows up in the scriptures in places where it doesn't make sense. The times where, in the early church, in Acts, in Paul's letter to the Corinthian church, there's references to people having joy specifically. It's in the same verse. You don't have to infer it from context. Yeah. They say it. There's joy in places where it just doesn't make sense. Like, how could you be happy? They're not happy, but there's joy.
It's interesting you say that because I mentioned on Sunday 8 times in the upper room discourse. That's John 14 to John 17. Jesus prays, talks about, invites joy. And there's zero earthly reason to be talking about joy if you know that what is before you is the cross. Right? And that isn't like what is before you in 5 years. That's what is before you inside of the next 36 hours, 36 hours, less than 36 hours, 12 to 18 hours, right?
Right.
So
we're going to shift a little bit and start to talk practically and personally as well. And so what we want to preface this next part with is the same preface that we've given many times here, partially just because I love a good preface, but also because these conversations, and especially when we start to get to our own stories, they're meant to be illustrative. They're meant to be examples. They're meant to be illustrations. They're not meant to be prescriptive.
Yeah.
So in other words, if your joy doesn't sound like our joy, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Because when we look at what Jesus says about joy, he actually says the same thing about hope, and he says the same thing about love, and he says the same thing about peace. He says, my peace I give to you. And he says that my joy may be in you. And he says that the Father loves me, so I love you. Right? It's all about God has a version of this that is true and right and good, and he's offering that to us. We're not being asked to go find it. We're not being asked to go manufacture it. That's what we often do. But when we talk about joy and peace and love, as Jesus talks about it, we're actually talking about us receiving something from him, not us mustering something up out of our own effort and understanding.
And that's a key difference, right? Because if we misunderstand how these things come about, how joy comes about, and we think it's on us mustering, it only creates what I would like to say is this really devastating cycle in our life when all of a sudden we're trying to, muster up joy, and we just find ourselves not having joy in situations that people think should have joy, not having happiness in situations people think could have happiness. We then usually just double down like, oh, I stink some more, so I have to try hard. There is no way to get out of that stronghold.
Yeah.
You just bind up in that way. So you got to know that this doesn't come from our work. It comes from the Holy Spirit's work in us. And so I will say this, if there is any work that we do in this, it's a word that Jesus already mentioned. Like, if you want to have my love in you, if you want my joy in you, he said, obey, right? Another word we don't like to talk about is submission. So if we have any work, that's what it is, obey and submission. And then what he does is he uses the fertile soil of our life to grow these fruits of the Spirit, especially this idea of joy.
Right. And again, don't hear obey and submission as, well, wait, you had just said before that I don't have to work to muster this up, and now you're saying obey, and that sounds like work. So
good,
and again,
good delineation.
Well, and again, it's more knowing how preconditioned many of us are to, okay, so you're saying I don't have to work for it, so how do I work for it? No, you don't have to work for it. Okay, but really, like when we get down to the fine print, how do I work for it? You don't have to work for it. It's a gift. Okay, so how do I have to work for it? Right? It's so hardwired in us to be our own God, to be our own provider, to be the source of everything and everything that we could need. And so we have to constantly come back. I have to constantly come back to this, that the source of peace, the source of love, the source of joy in my life is relationship and connection to God.
Yeah.
Not theological understanding, not church attendance, but a deeply personal, abiding, connected, creative, conversational relationship with God.
And you talked about theological understanding. I want to just, since words matter, right? You actually don't understand theology if you don't apply it right, right? And so I would say theological knowledge.
Yes.
Right? Because the Pharisees, the rulers of the law, the people who in just a few moments would be the people come to the Garden of Gethsemane with the help of Judas, who would, take Jesus and put him towards the cross. They had an immense amount of theological knowledge, but very little theological understanding, right? And that is really this thing. It doesn't come from this, let's just, have theological knowledge. It's really understanding what this means, because there's lots of people, lots of pastors who have lots of degrees behind their name who don't have joy. Me, long time, right? So that I'm not saying that from like I know a guy. I am the guy for a long time, right? And also this idea of that when you mention church attendance, and we understand church attendance looks different. So call it whatever you want. Listen to your podcast or watching online or physically coming into a building or your small group or your community group, whatever gathering of church people. That doesn't necessarily do anything either other than opens up an opportunity, but it doesn't do what only the Holy Spirit can do. In fact, one of the things that I mentioned on Sunday that I try not to repeat, because we tell people we hope you go back and listen, but I think some I want to repeat just quickly is this temptation that we have to typecast joy.
Sure.
So God has designed and wired us and made us to be in community. If you're not in community, you really need to get into community. If you need help, just let us know here at the church. We'll help you find a community for you. And because you learn more things about Jesus, you learn more things about how he expresses himself through different things. But, one of the things that could really be easy to fall into is that joy is about my temperament or my personality. And that isn't so, because there are just different sort of temperaments and personalities, and God has made you that way. But what happens is, I think it's really easy. My wife has just a joyous personality. She has a joyous temperament. She walks into a room and people are like, I'm so glad she's here. I walk into a room and they're like, oh, she brought him with him, right? That's just kind of how it works. I don't exude that. But one of the things I struggle with a long time is I begin to typecast. Well, if somehow have joy, I will act and live and respond like my wife, Kathy. But no, she acts and lives and responds out of the temperament and the wiring that God made her. Yeah. And so for you, when you get around other believers, you're going to see more Jesus, and you're going to have an opportunity. But don't begin to typecast it, because God has made you uniquely you. And sometimes, some of you, Johnny mentioned this, I wrote it down, that you said sometimes we struggle with happiness in situations we should be happy, right? There's also an equal problem that we think, or other people think, that we should look a particular way in a scenario, and because you don't look this, you might not have joy. That isn't the definition. What other people say does not define whether you have joy. Now, what other people say, we should listen and think and ask questions like, they don't think I have joy. God, do I have joy? So that's okay, but that isn't the definition. Yeah. So don't typecast it from the standpoint, because I always feel a lot of pressure. Like if all right. So it turns into work, right? So when the fruits of the Spirit come out of me, if I feel like it has to look like Kathy, that's a lot of work for me.
Sure.
And so at the end of the day, if it had to look like that, I don't feel like I walk away feeling energized from joy. I don't feel like I walk away with a sense of well-being. I feel like a sense of stress, because now I got to go put on what this looks like to the next group of people or the next or whatever it might be. So that's a bit of a side, but I do think it happens. And I don't think anyone signs up for it to happen. It's just really easy because, again, going by the definition, we have people that even say, oh, that's a joyous person. If you've ever seen, just went blank on it, but the Pixar movie that does the emotions, Inside Out,
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a really good message of the movie. It really is. I recommend it. Pixar understood theology without understanding theology in that way. But Joy is this yellow, bubbly, blah 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 person, right? And you think, oh, well, that's what it's supposed to look like. But that's typecasting. Mm-hmm. It only looks like that in people that God is wired to do like that. And maybe different it is. Mm-hmm. So anyway, all right, that's it. 2 soapboxes for me. I think I should soapbox done.
Well, and I think, too, that leads to a third sort of disclaimer, and it's similar to ones that we mentioned before, particularly with love, where how do I know what it looks like if I've not experienced it? And so I think then the next thing for us to just be aware of is once we start to get a taste for it, oftentimes in our need for closure, mm-hmm. we lock on and latch onto the first thing and decide, well, that's probably it and I don't need anything else. Mm-hmm. And so I think we often find that we'll limit how we define much of anything. Yeah. Joy, peace, love, freedom, relationship with God. Because once we've grasped this much, for many of us, it's just more practical, it's more efficient, it's simpler, it's mm-hmm. easier to just continue to do this rather than realize there might be all of this. And I think most of my arm was off the screen for that shot. But just imagine encompassing a lot of space mm-hmm. that unless other people either model it for us or describe it for us, or we engage, like you said, in a relationship with God of, do I have joy? But then asking a second question of what would joy look like in this situation? Yeah. One of our favorite questions to ask is, God, what are you saying about? And being willing to be curious about joy, being willing to allow it to expand into a much broader framework. Mm-hmm. And so it probably doesn't look exactly like Kathy mm-hmm. for you to experience joy, but there may be a whole lot of how Kathy experiences joy that is necessary for you to witness and understand and experience mm-hmm. to unlock more of what joy looks like in you. Yeah. And I'm only saying that because my wife has been instrumental in my capacity for joy to expand because I've seen her do it. And in some cases, I've actually needed to model myself after her for a while. Just like when we don't know how to do something, sometimes you need someone to follow mm-hmm. and be like, all right, I'm just going to do what they do until this starts to make sense and I can make it my own. Yeah, and I think it's a great example. Can I riff on that a little bit? Please.
I think also, I love that what John just was talking about, hey, be willing to expand more. I think another thing to be aware of is that once we start experiencing joy, it can be really easy because remember, joy is based upon the reality of the presence of God mm-hmm. in our life, right? Yep. It could be really easy then to begin to go and sort of formulaically say, well, this is how I'm going to do it. Yep. So one of the places I mentioned on Sunday, you mentioned this to John before we got on, that I can really feel God's presence lately is out taking a walk. That's phenomenal. Where it becomes a problem is if the only place I can feel God's presence, yes. right? Or like I feel like that I can't feel God's presence or I don't have joy, so I have to take a walk. Not I get to take a walk or I want to take a walk, but I have to. Because then what's happening is we're limiting the reality of how the presence of God works in us. When Jesus said in John chapter 17, it's best for you that I go away. The disciples couldn't wrap their head around it. His point was he'd already introduced the idea of the concept of the Holy Spirit, meaning this, that when I leave, it's actually better. Because right now, you're only in my presence when I'm physically with you. But now, my presence is going to be with you wherever you go. The presence of God, right, if we're believers, it's not like we're on the bus and he's trying to catch up to us. I mean, he's in us right there. And so that means that if the only place I can find joy is on a walk, at least I can find joy on a walk. Don't want anyone to feel ashamed about that. Mm-hmm. But if we become satisfied, God has more for us in that.
Yeah. And so again, some of this is just expansion of categories for us to have conversations with God about. Mm-hmm. And so if we're operating under the definition that joy and happiness are interchangeable, that's a really tough place to find joy. And so we may have to invite God into the conversation of what do I believe about joy? Because we all have an internal belief structure that may in some cases even be completely opposed to our intellectual mm-hmm. belief structure. And so inviting God into the conversation, God, what do I believe about joy, or about my capacity to have joy, or about what joy should look like if I have it? Or specifically, God, what do I believe about my ability to have joy right now in these circumstances? And so for me, one of the more recent times that God almost surprised me with my capacity for joy. We talked before, my wife and I bought an old farmhouse. We're renovating it. It was not a lovingly cared for old farmhouse where we just slap a new coat of paint on. This has been intensive.
If you ever sell this farmhouse, then it will be a lovingly cared for farmhouse.
It will be. After 2 years and 9 months, we just moved into the bedroom for the first time. And for so much of the last 2 years and 9 months, my joy felt conditional upon the completion of the project, or at least completion of significant enough parts of the project that I could then have joy. And what I didn't even realize I was doing was I was conflating happiness with joy.
Yeah.
That my joy was conditional on circumstances. And there was a moment, and it was about a year ago, where, and again, because the presence of God is with us all the time, we're not always aware of it, but as we choose to become more aware of the presence of God at all times, we get to invite him into all kinds of moments where we might not normally be able to benefit from his wisdom or his comfort or his insight or his direction or just the wonderful nature of his presence. But I was having this moment where I was inviting God into just a passing, no particularly spiritual significant moment, just a moment with God in the midst of the day. And he said, and I wish I could remember the exact words, but it was something to the effect of, don't confuse the condition of your home with my ability to use it. Because part of our vision for our home is that it's a place where people can come who just need a rest. That it can be sort of an oasis for people in the midst of trouble. And in my head it was, oh man, someday we're going to be able to get to that when this house is all fixed up.
Yeah.
And in spite of, I had that thought in spite of the number of interactions we'd had with people over the last year and a half where they'd come to our house while it still is a chaotic mess. And they'd said, there's just something about this place where I feel peaceful. And I'd hear that and I'd go, oh, that's really nice. And then someplace inside of me would go, that's not possible. This place looks like a train wreck. I don't have peace here. How do you have peace here? And so I had this moment with God where he sort of reframed my understanding of how I should look at this home around me. And I suddenly realized I have joy here. I have a deep-seated sense of contentment in the midst of this chaos. Nothing is finished. Nothing is right. Nothing is good. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is as it should be. And I have joy. It was almost a moment of, let me double check real quick. Yeah, that's joy.
Yeah.
And it's lingered, right? Happiness is circumstantial, situational. Joy seems to be more consistent. That joy, once I got a better understanding of what it looked like in that situation where it seemed like joy wasn't possible, I've continued to have joy in a place where it doesn't seem possible.
Yeah. There's a lot you said there I would probably dig into, but I'm gonna let that sit for what it is. But that's such a great reminder, because I think happiness is, you're talking about that, like, hey, my bedroom's done, but we still got to get the walk-in closet done.
Right.
So you enjoy it for one day, right? And then you're focused on to the next thing. And I think that's actually a really good barometer for ourselves as we're looking at our own faith, checking that, how long does that last, right? Because it comes and goes. And if it goes really quick, I'm pretty sure it's not joy.
Yeah.
Right? And again, there's nothing wrong with happiness. Nothing wrong with happiness. It's good. It's just kind of sort of where we're getting it from. I think, one of the key things as we, kind of wind down is this idea of where are we making room in our lives to experience joy with God lately. And you made some really good points. I'm going to hop to the second one first.
Great.
And you said, making space to play. The joy of simply being in his presence. That's a hard one for me. And for anyone who's heard me talk over the years, I've tried to be, I think, pretty transparent about things that I struggle with. There was a belief that I took on in my life early on that the only thing that was worse, let's see if I can say this right, worse than having fun and playing was the penalty I had to pay for the time I had fun. and play. And it was this idea that if I ever sort of stopped and took my hands off the steering wheel of my life and just enjoyed it, that there'd be so much chaos that happened when I took my hands off that it wasn't worth going to play. And so I sort of bought into this idea that, yeah, I might not like this, but it's not worth what I got to pay for later on. And it was an understanding that God had to bring into my life that that's not how a good father works. Yeah. Right? Now, that's how I believed he worked. Yeah. That's how I interpreted some things in my life that happened, but that really isn't. And so this making time is something I've been trying to do more lately. And I've had this sort of really interesting thing, like, you know, I'll go take a walk because I said, you know, I feel his presence more. But the other day, it was my birthday. And I just say this as like a transitionary moment. And my wife was at work. And she's like, well, what did you do on your birthday? And I said, I walked for 10 miles. And she looked at me like I had a third eye, right? But it's where I felt his presence and I had joy. But I realized in the midst of that, even if it was my birthday, which is crazy, right? Because most people say if there's any day you kind of do something for yourself, birthday. I thought, oh, well, shouldn't I be doing this? Isn't this irresponsible? Isn't something not going to get done if I do this? That sort of thing. And now I take that into just any normal day, right? Where like the most important thing you can do if God's calling you to be in his presence is to be in his presence. Because I can tell you this as a fact. Even just this week, as I was working on Sunday, I had one of those moments where anyone, and I mentioned it 2 Sundays ago, so this apparently is a theme with me over the last couple of Sundays, where I just hit a brick wall in what I was trying to understand what God was saying to me, and then trying to get it, even if I could understand it, then get it out on a piece of paper to talk to people. Yeah. And he's like, go take a walk. I'm like, I can't take a walk. I got a sermon to work on. Right? I can't do this.
Don't you know I have to talk about you?
Yeah, you know. And, you know, it was this moment where like, it's like, you know, trust me, if you're going to come and be in my presence, that's the best thing. I'm not saying that you're all of a sudden going to walk back and the sermon's just going to flow out of you, but I'm going to tell you that it's the best thing. And so, you know, I was like, all right, let me go take a walk. Now, the whole sermon didn't flow out of me. Right. But I will say this, there was a significant part where I was struggling in it. And in that moment, he made a point that was by me following him, right? And so, make space to just the joy of simply being in his presence. He wants to be in your presence. And trust me, he has the whole world in his hands. No matter how big your job is, even if you happen to be someone who literally had the world in his hands, right? He's got this. So a lot of us just experiencing this joy is not a work part, but just creating some space. Yeah. You know, I mean, we say this, so we talk to people, we're like, I'm having problems. We say, ask God, like, I'm having problems, hearing, what God's trying to say to me. We say a version of making space, and we say it this way. You're like, well, what are you doing? They're like, well, my TV's on, and I've got my phone. And like, you can't hear people around you when that's occurring. Yeah. How much more is it difficult to hear the still small voice of God in our life? So I really love that one. I know we're going to talk about reinterpreting your circumstances too, but that's the big one for me right now.
Yeah. No, and play is honestly such a helpful avenue towards the recovery of joy.
Because it feels irresponsible for some of us even saying play, like that's for kids. That's for kids.
It's such a good word, right? And that's the invitation, right? Come like a child.
Mm-hmm. Because we are as children,
much there,
right? Yeah.
Right? There's so much there. But a friend and mentor of mine used this phrase, joy bombs, to articulate something that he was learning in this area of recovering joy. And it was intentional practices where the primary focus was connecting to God, but doing it in a way that was disruptive to his normal routine. Mm-hmm. And he shared it with a couple of his buddies, and they all kind of came up with their own versions. And so one of the guys would, instead of doing coffee in the office at work, he'd run outside to his pickup and fire up his camp stove. Like he's got one of those little like rocket stoves with the propane burner on it. And he brew up like backpacking coffee, like one of those instant mix, boil up a little bit of water, dump in the powder. Like it's not great coffee. But he'd sit out there in the parking lot, sometimes in the dead of winter, with his little rocket stove and intentionally make coffee in a place where it just didn't make sense and it wasn't efficient, but it brought him joy. Mm-hmm. And it was a moment of connectivity, right? Because joy is essentially relational.
Yeah, I want to pause. Can I jump in over there? Listen, if you think that by definition God is always efficient, we misunderstand it. Because first off, God controls time. So efficiency as we define it isn't how he defined it. Pause, go back.
Yeah. Another one of the guys was like, he was, very like no nonsense. He's like, I started wearing flip-flops all over the place because it's really hard to be productive in flip-flops. It's like you can't work real hard on stuff, especially physically. So he's like, I started wearing flip-flops a lot. Somebody else was talking about like they'd get their mower out and they would just mow like random patterns in the grass, and they would eventually cut it all.
Sure, yeah.
But for a while, it was just like it was nonsense. And I actually did that one. I got a riding mower out where we are, and it was the first time that I got on a zero turn out at our place, and I was laughing out loud. It was so much like I was doing donuts. I accidentally popped a wheelie coming up a little hill, and the whole time I was just. And again, it wasn't an overtly religious experience, but it was just, I was aware of the presence of God, and I was intentionally being aware of the presence of God in the midst of just having fun. I wasn't thinking about, I need to keep these lines straight. I need to do this fast because I need to then finish this to get on to the next thing. It was, God, I'm going to come hang out with you for the next couple of hours. And I'm not going to take this so seriously that I lose the opportunity to just enjoy this experience with you.
Yeah. Good word. It's a good word.
But yeah, the other one, asking God to reinterpret your circumstances. There's a section in 2 Kings where Elisha's up in a room and they're surrounded by an army and his servant's freaking out, and Elisha says, "Go look again." And then he prays for God to give his servant eyes to see, and Elisha's servant sees that there is an army surrounding them. Mm-hmm. But then there's the armies of heaven surrounding the army surrounding them, and it was just I thought we were dead, and it turns out we're saved, and nothing's changed. Mm-hmm. All of that was actually real. I just didn't see it. And so oftentimes it brings us back to this idea of joy is available often when we don't think it should be, and joy is often actually found in the midst of hardship and trial. Yeah. And so asking God to interpret our circumstances for us, rather than insisting on believing that I see things clearly on my own. Mm-hmm. That this is a really hard situation, there's no possibility for joy, so I'll probably just get joy later. No. Pause and ask God, in this moment, right now, what would it look like for me to have joy? And again, we've shared, in different episodes on this podcast, I've lived through the trauma of a marriage ending in divorce. And I discovered that while it was not happy, there was a deep-seated settledness that I discovered, or that God uncovered for me, that as we're in the midst of this house renovation, God revealed where the joy was in the moment. Yeah. And as we talked fairly recently on a few of the episodes about this 10-year journey that my wife and I have been on to want children and to try to have children, we've been amazed at the joy that has existed in the absence of happiness in many instances. Yeah. There was a deeply settled sense of contentment, like Paul was talking about in prison. And if you caught me 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, I don't know that I would have believed that any of those situations could have been places where I was experiencing profound joy. Yeah. Yeah. And so some of it is just, again, ask God to reinterpret reality, to show us what we're not seeing.
So if, you find yourself engaged to what Scripture is talking about, engaged to what John and I are sharing, and you want to know more, dig more, ask questions, we'd love to talk to you. You can email us, as we say here all the time, faithforward@cfcwire.org. I think we're up to a grand total of maybe 5 emails in our history. But hey, we're happy to have you a sixth, because we engage this conversation with each other, and even if no one else listens or watches, I grow from it in that way. And we want to engage you too, because life is not meant to be lived just on whatever day you engage your community. Yep. If it happens to be Sunday, great. If it happens to be Wednesday, Tuesday, it's not designed to stay there. But what we learn from Scripture and we engage that is meant to be taken forward in every day of our life.
Yep. So we'll see you next time.